June 1950. The Korean peninsula was a land of ancient deceptive calm. But in the cold marble halls of Moscow and the bustling offices of Washington, this land was merely a line on a map, the 38th parallel. This arbitrary boundary drawn in a frantic hurry at the sunset of World War II had become a jagged scar across the very heart of a nation. For 5 long years, two hostile regimes had glared at each other across this wire, each claiming to be the true rightful soul of Korea. In the north, Kim Il-sung, a hardened guerrilla leader backed by the heavy steel of Soviet tanks. In the south, Syngman Rhee, an iron-willed exile fueled by American democratic ideals. The fuse was short, and while the world was looking the other way, the tension reached a breaking point. But the spark didn't ignite in Pyongyang alone. It was fed by a chilling shift in the global wind. By early 1950, the atmosphere had changed. Joseph Stalin, emboldened by the successful test of the Soviet atomic bomb and Mao Zedong's communist victory in China, finally felt the time was right. He gave his cautious, calculating blessing to Kim Il-sung's plan for unification by force. Yet Stalin was playing a masterful, cold-blooded game. He made his condition clear. The Soviet Union would provide the steel, the unstoppable T-34 tanks, and the lethal Yak fighters, but they would not provide the blood. Stalin hoped to bleed the Americans dry in a distant Asian quagmire, gambling that the West was too weary of World War to fight for a small, forgotten peninsula. Tragically, Washington inadvertently set the stage for the tragedy. In January 1950, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson delivered a speech that would change history. He defined the American defense perimeter in the Pacific, but crucially, fatally, South Korea was left out. To the communists, this wasn't just a speech, it was a green light, a public admission that the United States would not trade American lives for the streets of Seoul. The trap was set. The theoretical Cold War was about to turn brutally, tragically hot. On the dawn of June 25th, the silence was shattered forever. This is not just a story of a civil war, but the first open declaration of the Cold War. A conflict that would last for generations, sever families, and leave a scar that remains frozen to this very day. This is the story of the Korean War. On a rainy Sunday morning, June 25th, at 4 a.m., the gamble began. The silence of the 38th parallel was shattered by the roar of heavy artillery. The forgotten war had begun, and it would soon drag the entire world to the brink of a Third World War. The South Korean army was brave, but they were a constabulary force facing a professional invasion. They had no tanks, no heavy artillery, and no way to stop the Soviet-built T-34s. Within 3 days, Seoul fell. The Han River bridges were blown, leaving thousands of soldiers and civilians stranded. As the world watched in horror, the peninsula was being swallowed whole. American Task Force Smith, the first U.S. troops to arrive, was shattered at Osan. It seemed the entire country would fall into the sea within weeks. By August 1950, the map of Korea had shrunk to a tiny, suffocating pocket in the southeast. This was the Pusan perimeter, a 140-mile line of last resort. General Walton Walker's order, "Stand or die," wasn't just a slogan. It was a cold, hard necessity. There was no more land to give, only the sea behind them. If the North Korean T-34s broke through here, the Republic of Korea would be erased from history. The Nakdong River, once a symbol of life, was about to become a river of death. The most brutal anchor of this line was a small village called Tabu-dong, the gateway to Daegu. For 55 days, the hills of Tabu-dong became a literal meat grinder. In the scorching summer heat, soldiers fought hand-to-hand, often over the same few meters of dirt that changed hands 10 times a day. The stench of decaying bodies under the August sun was so overpowering that soldiers couldn't eat. It was here that South Korea's 1st Division, led by the young Brigadier General Paik Sun-yup, faced 3 elite North Korean divisions. When his men began to waver, Paik famously told them, "If I retreat, shoot me." They didn't retreat. They held the bowling alley against wave after wave of steel. While the regulars bled at Tabu-dong, a different kind of tragedy was unfolding at Pohangdong. Among the defenders were 71 student soldiers, boys who had traded their pens for M1 rifles they barely understood. At Pohang Girls Middle School, These children faced the veteran 5th Division of the North. For 11 hours, without a single professional officer to lead them, they held their ground. 48 of them died there. In the pocket of one fallen boy, Lee Yugun, was a letter to his mother. "Mother, I am scared. Will I be able to see you again?" He never did. Their sacrifice wasn't a tactical victory. It was a moral one that gave the UN forces the time to breathe. Before the world heard of Incheon, there was a silent scream at a beach called Yangsa. On September 14, 1950, while a typhoon raged, 772 teenage student soldiers were sent on a mission from which they were never expected to return. Crammed onto the Munsan-ho, their task was a lethal deception: to draw the North Korean divisions away from the West Coast. With only 3 days of training and cardboard shoes that dissolved in the freezing surf, these boys crawled through a hail of bullets to capture the highlands of Gyeongsa. They were the disposable heroes, abandoned by the tide, left to fight for 6 days without food or reinforcement. Most of them became ghosts in the sand, but their sacrifice achieved something critical. The North Korean command bit the bait. They turned their eyes to the east, leaving the back door at Incheon cracked open. As the blood of the students soaked the sands of Gyeongsa, General Douglas MacArthur was staring at a map of Incheon. Military experts called the plan a 1 in 5,000 gamble. Incheon's tides were among the most extreme in the world, with massive mud flats that could strand an entire fleet. But MacArthur saw what others didn't. On September 15th, the horizon of the Yellow Sea was blotted out by 261 warships. Under the cover of a massive naval bombardment, the 1st Marine Division stormed the seawalls. The surprise was total. In one stroke, the North Korean supply lines were severed, and the invincible Red Army was suddenly trapped in a giant pincer. The tide hadn't just changed, it had turned into a tsunami that would carry the UN forces all the way back to Seoul. By October 1950, the war seemed all but won. UN forces had liberated Seoul and crossed the 38th parallel, racing toward the Yalu River. General MacArthur famously promised his troops they would be home by Christmas. The North Korean army was in tatters, fleeing into the mountains. But as the Americans reached the border of China, they ignored a chilling reality. The shadows in the mountains were moving. Mao Zedong had already made his move. Hidden by night and camouflaged by the snow, 300,000 Chinese soldiers had silently slipped across the border. In late November, the trap snapped shut. In the brutal, jagged mountains surrounding the Chosin Reservoir, the 1st Marine Division found itself surrounded by an ocean of Chinese troops. But the greatest enemy wasn't the bullets, it was the cold. Temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. Weapons jammed, blood froze before it could clot, and the ground was too hard to dig foxholes. This wasn't just a battle, it was a struggle for biological survival. The chosen few were outnumbered 10 to 1, facing a relentless enemy that attacked in human waves, seemingly indifferent to death. Retreat? Hell, we're just attacking in another direction, General Oliver P. Smith famously declared. For 17 days, the Marines fought their way through a narrow 78-mile mountain road toward the sea. They brought their dead and wounded with them, refusing to leave a single soul behind. By the time they reached the port of Hungnam, they were walking ghosts, their skin blackened by frostbite. Behind them, the dream of a quick unification had vanished. The war was no longer about a small peninsula. It had become a direct confrontation between the West and the burgeoning power of Red China. By December 1950, the port of Hungnam had become the last exit from a closing trap. As the battered 1st Marine Division and the Army's 7th Division reached the coast, they found something they hadn't expected: a sea of humanity. Over 100,000 North Korean civilians, terrified of the approaching Chinese and North Korean forces, had gathered on the icy docks. They were begging for a place on the ships. The military plan called for the evacuation of troops and equipment only. There was no room for 100,000 ghosts. It was here that a different kind of courage took center stage. Dr. Hun Bong-hak, a Korean civil affairs advisor, pleaded with General Edward Almond to save the refugees. At the same time, on the deck of the SS Meredith Victory, Captain Leonard LaRue made a fateful choice. His ship was a small freighter designed to carry 47 people. To save the civilians, he ordered his crew to dump all military cargo, tanks, trucks, and ammunition into the freezing ocean. "We can replace the steel," he reportedly said, "but not the souls." In an impossible feat of logistics and compassion, 14,000 refugees were crammed onto that single freighter, standing shoulder to shoulder in the dark, freezing holds. Across the entire fleet, nearly 100,000 civilians were lifted from the shore, just as the Chinese moved in. On Christmas Day 1950, the Meredith Victory arrived at Gyeoje Island. During the 3-day journey through mine-filled waters, not a single life was lost. In fact, 5 babies were born on board. The Americans nicknamed them Kimchi 1 through 5. It was a flicker of light in the darkest winter of the Cold War. But as the ship sailed south, leaving the ruins of Hungnam behind, the political storm in Washington was just beginning to brew. The retreat from the north had ignited a firestorm of blame, and at the center of it was the most powerful general in American history. By the spring of 1951, the miracle at Hungnam had turned into a grim stalemate. The UN forces had stabilized the line near the 38th parallel, but the dream of a quick, total victory was dead. In Tokyo, General Douglas MacArthur was furious. He didn't want a stalemate. He wanted to win. He began to demand a massive escalation, bombing Chinese cities, blockading their ports, and even deploying atomic weapons along the border. For MacArthur, there was simply no substitute for victory. However, in the Oval Office, President Harry Truman saw a different, more dangerous reality. He knew that following MacArthur's path meant a direct war with the Soviet Union, a nuclear World War III that could end civilization. Truman chose limited war, a concept MacArthur found cowardly and treasonous. The breaking point came when the general openly defied the president's orders by sending a letter to Congress, challenging the administration's strategy. It was no longer just a war in Korea. It was a battle for the soul of American democracy. Who truly controls the sword? The elected president or the uniformed general? On April 11, 1951, the world was stunned by a radio bulletin. Truman had fired MacArthur. The public was outraged, treating the returning general like a Caesar while burning Truman in effigy. But as the dust settled, the dismissal signaled a cold, new reality. The era of the Great Crusade was over. From now on, the Cold War would be a long, agonizing marathon of containment, fought not for total victory, but for a fragile and exhausted peace. With MacArthur gone, the thunder of giant maneuvers faded into the grinding exhaustion of the stalemate. For 2 long years, the front barely moved more than a few miles, yet the dying continued. It was a war of jagged hills with names like Pork Chop, Old Baldy, and Heartbreak Ridge. Soldiers fought and died for meters of dirt just to improve a bargaining position at a wooden table in Panmunjom. The Cold War had found its most brutal expression, a war where no one was allowed to win, but no one could afford to lose. By 1952, the Korean War had lost its momentum. The fluid maneuvers of the early years froze into a jagged, 150-mile scar across the peninsula. The war was no longer fought over vast territories, but over steep, nameless ridges. Thousands of lives were traded for a single meter of frozen earth. Thousands of shells were fired to claim a hill that would be lost again by dawn. This was a war of attrition, a brutal cycle of death that soldiers called the meat grinder. In early 1952, in the rugged mountains of Yanggu, stood a range that would haunt a generation, Heartbreak Ridge. The U.S. 2nd Infantry Division faced more than just an enemy. They faced near-vertical cliffs and a labyrinth of North Korean and Chinese underground bunkers. Artillery flattened the peaks, turning stone into powder, but the moment the shelling stopped, the enemy emerged from their holes like ghosts. Soldiers had to crawl up vertical walls under a rain of grenades. Supply lines were severed, and carrying the wounded back down was a journey through hell itself. War correspondents, witnessing the carnage, gave it a name that stuck: heartbreak. It was the first true symbol of how meaningless, and yet how destructive, the battle for a single ridge could be. October 6, 1952. A massive offensive was launched against Hill 395, a strategic gateway overlooking the Chulwan Plains. For 10 agonizing days, the hill changed hands 24 times. From the sky, U.S. aircraft dropped napalm. On the ground, both sides unleashed 220,000 shells at one another. The mountain literally began to melt. Every tree and blade of grass was incinerated, leaving the jagged white rock exposed, looking like a giant white horse lying down in exhaustion. This was White Horse Hill. Infantrymen engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat at the summit with bayonets and rifle butts. The South Korean 9th Division held the ground, but the cost was a hill covered in white bone and crimson blood. The war became a cruel game of numbers. At Sniper Ridge, psychological warfare reached its peak. A single sniper's bullet could end a life in a heartbeat, and nightly raids drove men to the brink of madness. By the spring of 1953, the battle for Pork Chop Hill felt even more hollow. In Panmunjom, peace talks were nearing a conclusion. Yet on the ridge, names were still being added to the killed in action list every hour. The U.S. and Chinese forces poured entire divisions into a tiny outcrop with almost no strategic value. This wasn't a fight for military victory. It was a cold political gamble, using young lives as bargaining chips on a negotiation table miles away. July 13, 1953. Just 2 weeks before the armistice was to be signed, the Chinese launched their largest offensive of the year, the Kumsong Offensive. 5 Army corps smashed into the South Korean lines. There was nowhere left to retreat. Amidst monsoon rains and thick mud, the South Korean forces launched a desperate counterattack. To protect every inch of their soil, they poured their last rounds into the collapsing trenches. On July 27, 1953, the guns finally fell silent. An armistice was signed, not a peace treaty, but a ceasefire. A line was drawn across the 38th parallel once again, but this time it was a 4-kilometer-wide scar known as the DMZ. Two nations born from the same blood were now surgically separated by ideology and concrete. As the soldiers packed their bags, they looked back at a wasteland. 4 million people were dead, wounded, or missing. Cities were dust, and families were severed by a wire that would not move for generations. The Korean War was the moment the Cold War became a permanent reality. It proved that the world was now a chessboard where two superpowers would fight to the last drop of someone else's blood. It birthed the military-industrial complex and set the template for Vietnam, Afghanistan, and beyond. Today, the lights of Seoul shine bright against the darkness of the North, a living laboratory of two competing dreams. The forgotten war was never truly forgotten. It was simply frozen in time, a cold, jagged reminder of what happens when the world's giants decide to draw a line through the heart of a people. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next chapter of history. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a piece of history.